Welcome to So-and-So, brought to you by Bernina Made to Create. I'm Meg Goodman, and you're about to enjoy a casual conversation with a special member of the sewist and quilting community. A conversation about how they got started, what inspires them, what excites them, and their connection to this community. We are live and in person today at the American Quilt Society's Quilt Week in Paducah, Kentucky, with our very special guest, Bonnie Browning, AQS's Executive Show Director. Bonnie learned to sew, taught by her mom, at a young age. She made her first quilt top in 1979 in a Welcome Wagon Group in Burlington, Iowa, and finished her first quilt in college. Bonnie has won numerous awards with her quilting, including a third place at the 1986 AQS Quilt Show and Contest in Paducah, and that quilt, called A Little Bit of Candlewicking, is now in the collection of the National Quilt Museum. In the early 1980s, Bonnie was a member of the DBQs, a group of 7 quilting friends in Dubuque, Iowa. The DBQs were the first group to develop a quilting challenge and published that process in the spring 1986 issue of American Quilter magazine. After becoming an NQA certified judge in 1986, Bonnie began teaching and judging for quilt guilds and conferences across the U.S. and in every continent except Antarctica. In 1999, Bonnie represented McCall's Quilting on the committee to select the best 100 quilts of the 20th century. Bonnie became a certified teacher of Zentangle art in 2011 and has since combined her love of drawing and quilting into Zentangle quilting designs. Bonnie served as a technical director for the AQS quilting television show American Quilter that aired in 2005 on Lifetime Real Women. She's appeared on numerous TV shows and has written 13 books, one of which was a cookbook. Bonnie was named a Duchess of Paducah in April of 1996. Now, after 40 years and a rich life giving so very much to quilters worldwide, Bonnie plans to retire after this year's AQS show. Hello, Bonnie, and welcome to So-and-So.
Thank you. It's always good to talk to you.
You know, I'm worn out talking about all of the things you've accomplished and all you've done, and I can't wait to jump into this. We have a lot to talk about, and I want to start out with how you learned to sew from your mother, Mary Kirkland. Why did you decide to learn to sew, and what was one of the first things you ever made?
Well, do you know, my mother sewed, I have 2 sisters, and my mother sewed all of our clothes, everything from our underwear to our play clothes to our Easter dresses. And so I grew up with her always sewing. And I was one of these people who liked to work with my hands. I loved to do things with my hands. And so when I first learned to sew, I sat on my mother's lap at her treadle sewing machine. And she would let me guide the fabric through. So that was the first thing I sewed. But all through school, I made my own clothes. You know, I wore skirts and blouses, and so I sewed a lot of my own clothes as I went through. I'd say probably junior high and high school. And in fact, I don't think I had a purchase that my mother would have purchased piece of clothing until I was about in 5th grade. Now, sometimes I had purchased clothes because we had some family friends who had kids that were just a little bit older, and we got hand-me-downs from them.
Sure.
And so all 3 of my sisters and I, we wore the clothes Mom made for us, or sometimes they were given to us.
So you began as a sewist, and then you started to quilt. What got you into quilting?
Well, the bicentennial was really the impetus for that. There were several contests going on, and at the time, I was working as an executive secretary at Mercy Hospital in Davenport, Iowa. And I was busy. You know, we had night meetings and stuff, and so it wasn't a time for me to really do it then. But I had a women's meeting group that we set goals, and we set short-time and long-term goals, and we sealed them in an envelope. Well, so a few years passed, and my husband and I moved. He was transferred with the JC Penney company. We moved to Burlington, Iowa, and as I was unpacking, I ran across that envelope. And I had done everything that was on my list except make a quilt. And then I joined the Welcome Wagon Group there. And one day everybody was going around the room telling about what were their interests. And everybody that was there that day did some kind of needlework. And we didn't have a needlework group. And a lady raised her hand and said, if you all want to learn how to make some quilt blocks, I'll teach you. So we started a group where we all learned to make quilt blocks. Now, it was a sampler quilt. And like many people, those sampler quilts don't get quilted. I had chosen cotton fabric and polycotton fabric. Those two things don't sew together very well. And so while I learned how to do the technique of the blocks, I really didn't like the way it looked. It still is a quilt top. But I learned from that what I needed to learn about making quilt blocks and how to make the pieces fit together. That was the very first thing I did. Then I took some classes at the community college, and one of them was an art class, and we had to do some silk screening. I drew some weather vanes, silk screened those onto muslin, and there was one other older than the students were, a lady in the class, and she said, Bonnie, why don't you put that together into a quilt? And so I did. I hand quilted it. I entered it in a show with the local art group. And that was the very first quilt then that I made.
Do you still have that quilt?
I still do. And like many people, recently we took a picture of it at the office to show damage to a quilt. I hung it on a wall. And absolutely the worst thing for our quilts is to hang them on a wall and leave them where the sun can get to them. And so the red that was in that quilt is now kind of an orangey, faded out red looking color. And so if you're making quilts, don't hang them on the wall for a long period of time, which is what I had done.
Good advice. So we're talking about the sewing and the quilting you did when you were younger. Is there anything interesting about when you were a little girl that people would like to know outside of the sewing and things?
Well, really how I learned to work with my hands is one of the things my mom always did at Christmas time is she would find a pattern in a woman's magazine or something to make Christmas ornaments. And for years and years and years, every Christmas, my sisters and I got to make Christmas ornaments. We made them for people. My favorite one was a glass chimney like you would use on a lamp, that you light the lamp and has a glass chimney. And so we decorated that all up and it looked like Santa Claus. And you filled it with red and white striped candy. And it was I still have one of those.
You do?
That we made way back when. But over the years, I've made a number of those even since then.
So you've been very talented in crafting and creating things. And as you quilted more and more, you made a quilt called A Little Bit of Candlewicking, which is now in the collection at the National Quilt Museum. Tell us about that quilt.
Well, it's candle wicked, and it is sort of a sampler quilt. I used a pattern for that, and then I sewed it together with some sashing and hand quilted it. And my friends all said, gosh, Bonnie, you need to enter that quilt in that new group down there in Paducah, Kentucky. And so I made it in 1985. And in 1986, I was finally brave enough to enter that quilt in the AQS Show here in Paducah. And at that time, there was a category that was called Other. And it was for quilts that were embroidered or used other techniques other than piecing or applique. And I came to the show. That was the first show I entered, but I also attended the show for the first time in 1986. But I have to tell you, when I entered it, I sent it in and I didn't say a word to anybody. Because you know what? It's sort of like, okay, so what if it doesn't get in? Even though my friends thought it was beautiful. And so I didn't say a word until I got that letter that said, your quilt is accepted, ship it to Paducah. And so consequently, I did do that. And at that time, the show book was much simpler than it is today. It was all in black and white, and the winner's list was printed on a separate piece of paper. And so I had paid my admission, and I was going in the door, and there were some people in front of me. So I thought, oh, well, let's just open up this list of winners and see who won. And I'm going down the list, and for crying out loud, there's my name. And I still get goosebumps when I say that, because what a thrill that was. Then my next problem was I hadn't even bought a ticket to the awards presentation. So then that was my next problem, is I had to get a ticket. And that's like, okay, so did I even bring anything that I could wear on the stage?
That's right up there with concerns. Absolutely.
Yes. Well, I had a skirt and a white blouse, and so that is what I wore to the awards that night. But what a thrill that was. I know that the quilters think they're a winner, even when their quilt is accepted and they get to ship it here to be displayed. But gosh, to be a winner, that just is a whole other thrill.
I can tell as you're telling me the story that it's very important to you, and you're remembering it like you're there right now. What a special time.
Well, and my mother passed away a year or so ago, and I couldn't believe when my sisters gave me the stuff that Mom had saved about me. In that group of papers is an article from the Dubuque, Iowa newspaper of me working on a little bit of candle wicking in my living room. I'd completely forgotten that I had done that kind of an interview way back when.
Special. Bonnie, tell us about the DBQs.
Well, the DBQs, that's the letters for the Dubuque, Iowa airport. And it was 7 women. We all worked in different styles of quilts. But you know what? It was a group of 7 women that just hit it off. I've belonged to a lot of groups since then, but I've really never developed the same attachment. And I still communicate with most of those ladies. But we decided that we wanted to do some kind of a challenge, and it would show off the variety and the skills that we had and the styles that we worked in. And so we ordered this kit of Amish colored fabrics from Keepsake Quilting. They always sent out a catalog and you got to choose, and they had batches of fabric that they put all together. And so we ordered one of those for each of us. We worked on a design, and we had an unveiling party of our quilts at our house with our husbands. That was the first we'd seen of each other's work. And we entered all of those in the Paducah Quilt Show. And we really wanted them to do it as a special exhibit because it was different, and nobody had done those kinds of challenges up to that point, or at least we didn't know of them. And we ended up, they were all accepted in the show so that they got to be displayed as a contestant quilt. And oh gosh, what fun. But then we also worked with a writer from Dubuque who wrote a story about the DBQs and this quilt challenge. And it was published in the American Quilter Society's magazine. And I believe that was the very first time anybody published what they did. And it really set off the whole trend of quilt challenges with quilt guilds all over this country.
That's a wonderful legacy. Do you still keep in touch with your fellow DBQs?
Oh, I certainly do. I certainly do. In fact, I just saw somebody, Joan Tully was one of my friends there. I saw that she had commented on somebody's post on Facebook recently. And so I sent her a little note. I hadn't talked to her for a while.
Social media is a wonderful connector.
Yes, it is.
Bonnie, you're an expert in Zentangle.
Yes.
Tell us about that. What is that?
Zentangle is a drawing method. Maria Thomas and Rick Roberts developed this method. She is a professional calligrapher, and she worked and did invitations for Fortune 500 companies. I mean, she's really, really good. And one day she was sitting at her kitchen table doing some drawing, and Rick said, "You know what? You were sitting there almost in a Zen state all on your own." And so the more they talked about what she was doing at that time, they said, I wonder if we could teach other people to do this. And they went away for a weekend and decided they would just see what they could develop over that weekend. And really, they developed the whole program that they have now. There are several thousand certified Zentangle instructors all around the world. And it's a method where you we work on a 3.5-inch tile, and we divide that tile up into space. And so then what you do is you take and repeat the same line to fill those spaces up. And so you really only need to know how to make a dot, a straight line, a C, an S. That makes up all of the things that we draw. And by repeating these designs, it makes some of the most beautiful artwork. And sometimes we add color. We usually add shading to it with a lead pencil. And we use an artist tool called a tortillon that is just smudger. It's a smudger and just smudges that pencil a little bit. But I've always drawn, even as a kid, I was a drawer. And so when I saw that, and so I was certified in 2011. And at that time, I became certified because I was thinking about retirement. And what was I going to do after I decided that I didn't want to be the show director? And really the amount of work and all the details, I wanted something that was not going to be quite so stressful. They say being an event planner is probably the 6th most stressful job behind policemen and firemen.
I believe it.
Because of all the things you have to juggle.
Sure.
Yes. Well, anyway, and so it's, I did a book on Zentangle Art to Go. And I actually now, in my future, I intend to do some iQuilt online classes combining Zentangle in making quilting designs like background fills for your quilts. I keep telling people if you're doing your own designs, you really need to take a good Zentangle class. It'll help you make a whole lot more designs.
So 13 years ago, when you were planning for this retirement,
yes,
you had lots of time to get ready for this.
Yes.
Now, during your career, you've judged quilts on every continent except Antarctica. I love that.
That's true.
Do you know how many quilts you've judged?
Oh my gosh. I have my friend Claudine Hansen, who used to work with us here at AQS. She kept good records, and she had judged like 30,000 quilts or something like that. Honestly, I haven't kept those kinds of records. Yeah. I've judged a lot, though.
I'm sure. Now, are there any quilts that particularly stand out that you've judged?
Gosh, the techniques that the quilters are using, I don't know. My favorite one is like, okay, what's happening new today? And I like color. I like different techniques. I don't really have a favorite of those. And I don't know. I guess it's walking through the quilt show. There are lots of quilts down there.
Sure.
That I certainly would take home with me.
Well, and you've seen quite the evolution of techniques and what's been acceptable and come into vogue, and a lot of changes. Now, in 1999, so we're going to go back 25 years, you represented McCall's Quilting on the committee that chose the best 100 quilts of the 20th century. Can you tell us about that competition, what it was like judging these quilts, and maybe about a few of the quilts that were chosen?
Well, I can tell you that McCall's Quilting asked if I would represent them. I think they had some other people that were doing some other things to do with choosing those quilts. And so they called me one day at AQS and said, would you be on this committee? And so what we had to do, first of all, was choose 100 quilts that we thought should be considered. And to be honest, I don't even remember how many people were on the committee, but it was a pretty large committee. Well, and they wanted not only the name of the quilt, the name of the quilt maker, but they wanted a picture of it if we could. Well, being at AQS, I had access to lots of books and things. And so actually, Carrie Bresnahan, who was coordinating that from Houston, even called me out as being one who sent them a lot of really good information. Okay, so then once we did that, they calculated all of the different quilts that were entered. And then I think we had to maybe break it down to the top 20 in our estimation. So they sent us the whole list and we had to choose 20. And then from that, they chose the top 100 quilts for the 20th century. Gosh, there are lots of quilts that are old quilts, even that were included in that, older than what we see today. Libby Lehman had a quilt in it, Carol Fallert, Ricky Timms, many of the people who are out there teaching a lot today had quilts that were included in that. And they were included because they were making good quality quilts, beautiful quilts when we did that. Gosh, that was clear back in 1999, and it was really to celebrate the millennium.
Are those quilts in a collection somewhere, or were they just mentioned and noted?
They are not in a collection. They were all displayed at the Houston show that year in 2000. But no, because many of them were, some of the quilt makers were deceased even by that time. But no, they did do a book, though, about those quilts and had pictures of all of them. So I think that's the only thing you would find today is the book that has the pictures of all of those quilts.
And we'll make sure we make a note on that in our show notes so the people joining us today can find that book if they want.
Yes.
Bonnie, what's Quilt Camp for kids?
Oh my gosh. When I first came here, we had even clear back in 1994 when I came, we were talking about how do we get young people involved in quilting. And the museum, the National Quilt Museum, at that time it was the Museum of the American Quilter Society, was new in 1991, and I came in 1994. And so I asked the question, could we do a kids camp for kids at the Quilt Museum? And so, yes, we did, and I did that for 10 years. And I have to tell you, it was the hardest work I did all year long.
What made it hard?
Well, we had, in the mornings, we always started with the youngest people in the mornings when they would be freshest. And so we had first through third graders, and then we had fourth through seventh graders. And it was a different project for each one of them, but they sewed by hand so that they had to thread a needle. Oftentimes we did a project that they had to sew on a button. Some of those really basic skills that you learn when you first start to sew. But then we had adult supervisors, and then they also got to use the sewing machines. And surprisingly enough, I would say out of 20 children, probably 5 or 6 of those would be boys. And of course, they loved it when we got to the sewing machines. Now we're working on a tool.
Sure. Doesn't matter that it's a sewing machine. It's a tool that is powered.
Yes. Well, and so now today, I did it for 10 years. And then they hired an education coordinator at the Quilt Museum. So they've certainly have continued that. But just yesterday here at the Quilt Show, I had a young woman. I was filling in for lunch at the door, and this lady came in the door, and she said, "Do you remember me?" And I looked at her, and I said, "No." And she said, "I was in your very first kids camp."
Oh my,
can
that's
you believe
special.
that?
That's very
Today
special.
she is 37 years old. Well, then as she got ready to leave, she said, "Can we take a selfie?" And so we took a selfie. But yes, and so I said, "Are you still making quilts?" And she said, "Well, not so much quilts, but I am sewing." And I think some of the younger people they're going back to making their own clothing again.
That is a trend that we're hearing a lot on this podcast as well. Upcycling, recycling, making your own clothes.
Yes. Well, anyway, that was a real thrill to run into her. And golly, look how long that was.
and what an impression you made on so many lives. And speaking of that, one of the things that we're celebrating this year at AQS is 40 years of AQS, and you have decided to retire as the executive show director. What did you say? The 6th most stressful job, undoubtedly.
Yes.
So I'd like to go back in time a little bit and start with how you came to AQS in the first place. How did you get started here?
Well, I came to the AQS Quilt Show in 1994 in April, and almost the first thing that I heard was, Bonnie, they're looking for a show director. And prior to that, Meredith Schrader and her daughter, Lynn Lloyd, had been doing the work of an executive director for the quilt show. And Lynn and her husband were adopting a child, and she wanted to stay home with the child. And so they decided they really needed to hire somebody. Well, prior to that, for 4 years, I had been the first vice president of the National Quilting Association, which was a totally volunteer group. And my job as the first vice president was to select the show site for their quilt show. And they moved it around the country to a different venue every single year, which meant I was busy traveling to different cities and checking out hotels and facilities. And so I had a lot of that experience before I came. And then, of course, managing the show while it was going on. So when I got home from the show here in Paducah that April, I sent a letter to Meredith and said, I heard that you were looking for a show director. I'd like to talk to you about that. And so she wrote back and said, well, yes, we are, but you have to move to Paducah to be able to do it.
And were you in Iowa?
No, actually, my husband had just retired from the JC Penney company, and we had just built a new home in Nixa, Missouri.
Oh.
And so we said, I said to Wayne, well, I guess we could. And I said we could maybe keep this place for a vacation home or something. Well, and so I came for an interview, and that was in July. And in August, I was hired to come and be the show director here. And then we decided we'd rent. We didn't know if I was going to like this job or what. And so we finally decided that we would move to Paducah totally. And so we put our house in Nixa on the market Thanksgiving week, and we sold it in 1 week. I guess that meant we were supposed to be there.
Indeed.
Yes.
It did.
Yes.
So you started right out of the gate as show director. It wasn't like you were doing other tasks and promoted to that. You just hit the ground running.
No. Well, and for years, I was the only employee that was really working on the quilt show.
Were there volunteers that came by your side as you got closer to the show, or you did it all?
Well, no. Just like this week, every employee of the American Quilter Society is here working at the show. At that time, we also were publishing books. And so we had a whole group of people that were editors and designers. And so, it takes about 60 people to run this quilt show here in Paducah. Mostly because we have things in multiple places.
Sure.
The other shows that we do, we have a convention center with an attached hotel, and all of the classrooms are in the convention center, and all of the exhibit spaces in the convention center. We do that with 15 people.
That's remarkable.
Yeah. So the difference, it's a lot harder to do the show here just because we have multiple places.
Let's talk about your tenure. I know that there have been many notable events. I'd like to start out with the flood in 2011. Tell us about that.
Well, it was Easter Sunday, and we were here at the convention center judging quilts. And because it was Easter, we had ordered a catered dinner, and so our dinner had arrived, and we were all sitting at tables out in the lobby having Easter dinner. And in walks the mayor, the head of our parks department, the city manager, and they said, folks, I hate to say this to you, but we have to put the floodgates in. Well, we have, I think, like 12 or 15 miles of floodgates that surround the riverside of this city, and it doesn't happen quickly. It takes them a week or more to put all of the floodgates in to keep the Ohio River out. And so then we said, oh gosh, so what are we going to do? And so we kind of split up. Our staff split up, and Some of us went looking for facilities where we could do classes. Others went looking for buildings where we could move vendors and quilt exhibits. And at that time, the Dome Pavilion was sitting where the Holiday Inn sits now. So it was on
the riverside of the floodgates.
It was on the right side, in the city side of the floodgates. And our decorator, of course, had been here working from Friday, Saturday, Sunday, getting everything all set up so the vendors could move in Monday afternoon. All right, well, here we are at Sunday. The decorator, it was a decorator out of Nashville, Tennessee, and so they called in another crew because they had to take it all down. Even the part that was already set up in the pavilion had to be reset. And what we found was the Baptist church had 10 classrooms. We have 10 classrooms here in the convention center. We just renamed the classrooms at the church, the same names as the classrooms here. We got the ball team from a local community, from a local college, who came in because they had no freight elevator at that church. Every table, every chair, every sewing machine had to be carried up the steps. And so these young ball team members carried it all up, and at the end, they carried it all down, too. And we found 2 buildings out by the mall that were vacated. I can't even remember what they are now, but they were real close to one another. And so I had calculated that if we gave the sponsors the 2 booths that they always get, and everybody else got 1 booth, we had enough room in those 2 buildings and the pavilion to be able to have everybody here. Well, okay, so we all collected back here, going over everything that we needed to do. And there was a great sentiment for we should just cancel this show. And I said, we would never survive the PR aspect of that if we did. And I mean, the hotel rooms are non-refundable. The airplane tickets were non-refundable. Here we are, it's Sunday. There were already people in town. Other people were on their way. And so by the time we left that evening, we had a space for everybody who wanted to be here. And we did have a few vendors decided they weren't going to come at all, which helped a little bit. The decorator was working. We had to install electrical out at those 2 buildings because there wasn't enough electricity to be able to have vendors all be able to hook up to electrical. And our decorator worked overnight to be able to get everything moved and set up so that on Tuesday, our goal was that on Tuesday morning, we would be able to let the vendors in. And, you know, I'm one of these people who wakes up in the middle of the night trying to solve a problem. And I find if I write it down, then I can go back to sleep. And the only thing we hadn't figured out was All-Star Review is one of our most popular events. And it's where our teachers do a demonstration. And we used to do it here where we would put like 4 tables spaced on each wall in the classrooms. And the people moved and went from table to table. Well, I woke up in the middle of the night and thought, you know what? If we just use that chapel and let them each do their demonstration only once, we could still do the All-Star Review. And so that's what we did. And I have to tell you, people loved it so much. That is the way we do it now. The teachers do their demo, and then afterwards, everybody can meet the teachers for the last half hour, get their autographs, whatever they want. But, you know, they love to rub elbows with the teachers. And we had to change everything. We had to change our insurance. We had to change the bus routes. I mean, literally everything that we do to make the show happen in those 72 hours that we had to happen. And, you know, we did it. And the people that had been here before and knew how we did it previously couldn't believe we did it. The people that were here for the first time thought it was just wonderful.
Memorable.
Yes.
And it speaks to the people in the town of Paducah, as you had mentioned when we met you 2 years ago, how every year they come around this show to make it happen. They just did in a much larger way that year.
Well, yes, and certainly I hope we don't have to do that again.
Indeed.
But you know what? I even wrote an article for one of the meeting magazines about that, and I was really on, make sure you have a plan B, because we really just had to think off the cuff of what has to happen and how are we going to do it. And you know what? Basically, for the show, like this week during the show, I live for Wednesday morning when the doors open. After that, it just runs, and it really is all that planning that we do in advance that makes that all happen. But we made that one run too.
Yes, you did. Besides that, which is certainly notable, are there any other events or things over your tenure that come to mind that really made an impression on you?
Katrina, the quilters are always the first to know what can we do to help. And we were getting inundated after Katrina with what can we do. And so we said, if you will send quilts to AQS, we will get them to Louisiana. And lo and behold, we never anticipated that we would get 10,000 quilts. Our guys at the warehouse had skids, and they were putting them according to size, crib size, twin size, full size. I don't even know how many truckloads, but they wrapped them in plastic on skids. I mean, that's how many we had. And then we were able to find drivers that were coming through Paducah or leaving from here to take those quilts home to Louisiana. Now, what did we learn from that? We learned that it would be a whole lot smarter for us to find a contact in Louisiana and have them shipped to Louisiana so that we didn't have, I mean, I can't even tell you how many man hours that our people spent of just unboxing them, getting them skidded up and getting them onto a truck. And so that's what we've done since then. When there's a fire out west and people want to send quilts, we make the effort to find somebody there that they could be shipped to, and then we promote that to people. And so that was one thing. 9/11 was another one. All of us, I think, were struck by that. And so what we did for 9/11, we invited the quilters to make a 9-inch finished, 9.5-inch unfinished quilt block and ship those to us. Or they could make a whole quilt top, or they could make a quilt and we'd find quilters. And so we got thousands of blocks, and they were sorted out and sent to people who volunteered to do sewing of them. I think we ended up with about 135 or something quilts. And then we had an online auction. And the proceeds from auctioning those quilts were sent to the Firemen and Policemen's Fund, and then also to the group that trains the dogs that they use in that kind of an incident. But those auctions ended up at 4:00. At that time we were working 8 to 4. And so it would be right before closing time. And so I would go on to the auction about 3:45 and check out what's happening with these auctions. Well, and so sometimes, there'd be a bid of $50 or $100, and I knew it had to bring more money than that. And so I would start bidding, and I actually bid on some quilts that meant something to me. Maybe I'd taught for that quilt guild that made a quilt that sent us or something. And, anyway, Bonnie ended up buying 8 of those quilts.
And do you still have those quilts?
Well, I have. You know what? My brother is not well, and so I shipped him a red, white, and blue quilt, mostly because I just thought he'd enjoy having that on his bed. And so I've given a couple away, but I still do have most of those quilts. And mostly because it was a group in Milford, Pennsylvania that I'd gone out and taught at. And Huntsville, Alabama sent us a quilt, and it was a big sampler quilt. And so most of them are red, white, and blue. And well, anyway, so I contributed to that cause.
In a big way, you did, both running it and contributing.
Well, and I often, the Quilt Museum here has an auction usually every year. And so I have bought quite a few quilts through that as well. And we had an auction as a fundraiser for Libby Lehman after she had her stroke. And so I usually try to buy some that I can use them in my teaching. And so, I look at them with that critical eye when I'm bidding on them. And so I have bought lots of quilts over the years.
So, Bonnie, after the show, you are going to retire. Why now?
Well, do you know what? It's time for somebody else to have to do all of this work. In June, I'll be 80 years old. And, my mother lived to be 98 and a half. And so I'm still looking like there's still life out there for me.
Mm-hmm.
But I have some other things that I want to do. My sister and I are going to South Carolina next month to visit my brother and his wife. I'd like to do some traveling of my own. I still want to make some iQuilt classes that would be on the internet. And I have a brand new Bernina sitting in a box in my kitchen. That's my retirement gift to myself. I bought the Bernina 790 Pro, and I have not opened the box yet because right now I don't have time to play with it. You know what? When you have a new sewing machine, you have to have time to play. So I've saved that until a week after next when my work at AQS will be done.
What do you want your legacy to be?
Oh, goodness. I've written 13 books on quilting, and always I have wanted people to learn the very basics of how to construct a quilt. And I've ended up, when I teach, that's what I teach, is I want you to know how to do it well. Did you know we've done a program at AQS called Quilt Chat a few years ago, and I always tried to make sure that one segment of that was a technique or something that they could learn something, so that we weren't just giving them information about what was going on. You could learn something. And one of the videos that we did was how to join the ends of your binding. To date, well, anyway, so I asked Alan, our photographer, could he just clip that part out so that we could just put that on our YouTube channel, which is Quilt TV? And he did. And to date, 720,000 people.
Oh, my.
And I can't tell you how many people have come up to me here at the Quilt Show saying, thank you so much for that video. I watch it every time I put a binding on. And it's one of those things is you just forget how to fold that fabric. And so I did it as simple as I could do it. But that's the kind of thing I really want people to remember, is that they learned some good techniques to make quilts. And I always say, once you know how to make it and have it be flat and all your points meet and everything, you can break all the rules that you want to break, and it's still going to turn out to be a good-looking quilt. So I hope that's what people go away with remembering about me.
Looking forward, Bonnie, what's your dream?
Oh, gosh, I don't even know. I'm going to do some remodeling in my house. I want to have some painting done, and I want to change some flooring a little bit and update it. But I'm going to stay here in Paducah. I have a ranch house, and so even if I get more feeble, I won't have to worry about steps. Gosh, I don't know that I have any really major dreams other than that I still do have some traveling I'd like to do. I'd like to do a train ride across the country, where it's more leisurely and I don't have to be at the wheel of a car. I've always said I'd like to do a safari. I don't know about that because I don't know if I'm up to sleeping in a tent on a safari. But I do have some traveling that I'd like to do. I'd like to go to Tuscany. You know, I enjoyed going to the Bernina factory the year that I did that, and a friend and I, Anita Shackelford and I, bought a train ticket and went a few days early and covered the whole country,
Mm-hmm.
except for the area where Bernina was, and of course we knew we would be there eventually
Sure.
anyway. Um, but I don't know. I guess I just who knows what's going to come next.
Many things, many opportunities. We've talked about so much. You've shared a lot with us today. Is there any question I didn't ask you that you wish I had?
Well, I'd like to tell you about the first trip I made to Japan
Okay.
because it was probably the most memorable international trip I made. NHK, that sponsored the Great International Quilt Festival there, had come over to Paducah and met with Meredith Schrader and I several times because they were trying to put on this quilt show over there in Japan. And so we'd met with them here, and so they invited me to come be one of 7 judges, all the others being speaking Japanese and Bonnie, and so they had an interpreter for me. Well, then they asked me if I would be a speaker at the opening of the show while I was there. And so, yes, I did that. And so, right before I was ready to go on, they said, "Oh, Bonnie, I forgot to tell you, the princess is sitting in a chair on the stage, but back a little ways. And when you cross in front of her, you need to just bow your head to recognize her both ways when you go to the microphone." So I did that, and then she was to have a private tour of the exhibit, and they wouldn't let anybody in until she was out of the building. And so they were trying to whisk her away, and she came back to me and in perfect English said, "This is no fun to do by yourself. Will you go with me?"
Oh,
So I
my.
got to take her through the quilt exhibit. Well, little did I know that we would round a corner and here's a whole bank of paparazzi taking pictures of the princess and, of course, with me. So I asked them if I could have one of those pictures. And, of course, the palace had to approve it before they could send it to me, which they did. The other person that was there, because AQS had shipped an exhibit of some of our contest quilts over to be displayed there. And Nancy Cassabaum Baker, she's the wife of Howard Baker, who at that time was the ambassador to Japan. And anyway, and so she was there sitting right next to me on the stage. And so then afterwards, I said to her, I would like to introduce you to the American vendors that are here. And they put all of the American companies on what they called America Street. And so I took her down the aisle and introduced her. And when we got to the end, she said, "Do you know what would be really fun? If you all would like to come to the ambassador's residence one evening this week, and we'll have wine and cheese." So she gave me her phone number. I called her the next day. We set it all up for Tuesday evening. And this was in 2011. So this was not too long after 2011. And so I called her, we got it all set up. We all jumped in taxis. And in fact, they wouldn't even let the taxi drive on the property. They had to leave us out at the end of the driveway and we had to walk in. So when we got in there, I said to her, "Do you know what would be fun is before we leave, if we could take a picture of all of us with you and the ambassador." And so she said, "Yes, Bonnie, but you'll have to take care of it because I'm not any good at that." So I went in this room and here's this beautiful bay window and in front of it is a sofa and some chairs. And so I went back out and I said, "Is it okay if I move the chairs around a little bit?" She said, go ahead and do it." So anyway, so we all got ready for the pictures and they had a houseman and there were about 20 of us. And so there were 20 cameras lined up in front of the sofa so that he could pick up and take a picture with each camera. And then afterwards, Ambassador Baker then told us a little bit about the history of the building there. And I didn't realize, but every stick of anything in that building is from the U.S. The only thing that the U.S. doesn't own is the land it sits on. And anyway, and then he said, and at the end of World War II, when MacArthur met Emperor Hirohito at the end of the war, was right in this room, right where you took this picture. And at the time, MacArthur would only allow one photograph to be taken. And I should have listened to that. He said. Well, anyway, it was a very memorable event and had a little bit to do with AQS or the United States history, and they were very hospitable. And I think many of the vendors felt the same way, that it was something that they had never done anyplace else.
What a wonderful experience. And Bonnie, this conversation has been wonderful. Thank you so much. It's been an honor to talk to you. The legacy that you're leaving, we wish you the very best with all of the things that you'll get to do going forward. And I want to thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me. You know, I always like to talk to you, and especially if we can talk about quilts.
Indeed. Bonnie, if people want to keep in touch with you going forward or see what you're up to, is there a way they can stay in contact with you?
Yes, my website is bonniebrowning.com. And I haven't been on my blog very much, but I plan to have a resurgence on that as well.
Wonderful. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Well, there you have it. Another story about a very special someone who dedicated their life's work to quilters around the world. Someone for whom quilting is so much more than a hobby. It's a way of life, a connection to something bigger. And that something bigger is certainly something much better for the efforts and love of Bonnie Browning. If you know someone you think has an outstanding story, a story that should be shared on this podcast, please drop me a note to meg@soandsopodcast.com. or complete the form on our website. Be sure to subscribe to, review, and rate this podcast on your favorite platform, and visit our website, soandsopodcast.com, for more information about today's and all of our guests. That's SEWANDSO podcast.com. And finally, I want to thank Bernina for making this program possible. I'm Meg Goodman, and I look forward to you joining us next time on So and So.